I'd like to ask about a recent lecture you have given at the University of Michigan. You used John Rawls' theory of justice to argue for three principles of corrective racial justice. These are principles of justice that you believe we should put in place to create a social system based on racial equality and justice. They include one, ending second-class civic status, two, ending racial exploitation, and three, ending racial disrespect. How does each of these principles relate to white violence? And how can white people act in order to use these principles to prevent white violence?
Sure, thanks for the question. I should say, first of all, I'm really using a modified version of Rawls because unfortunately, though Rawls is seen as the most important American political philosopher of the 20th century, he barely talks about race, and this pattern has been reproduced in his disciples and his followers. So next year, 2021, will be the 50th anniversary of Rawls' famous first book, A Theory of Justice. And in those 50 years, despite the long history of US racism, both to indigenous peoples and to blacks and later Asian immigrants, Japanese, Chinese people, Latin people, the subject of racial justice is virtually completely absent from this body of work. So it's a sort of wonderfully clear-cut example of the whiteness of the academy, not merely in terms of the population, but in terms of subject matter. And linking up again with the point that Daria made earlier, the sort of crucial importance of decolonizing the syllabus, decolonizing the curriculum, decolonizing the way we look at things. And philosophy has been, in a sense, one of the most backward of the humanities in this process. Things are much further advanced in other areas. And one sort of a good starting point, in my opinion, would be decolonization of the theory of justice. Because if you can have a theory of justice in a white supremacist state that says nothing about racial justice, that is as clear-cut an example as you would like of the extent to which it's basically following the sort of colonial norms and taking as its reference point the white population rather than looking at people of color. So as I say, it's not Rawls's principles, it's using Rawls's apparatus and modifying it for the question of looking at social oppression. So the three principles I argue that you would come up with are, as you said, ending second-class status of people of color, ending racial exploitation, ending racial disrespect. And what I see as a link with white violence is that they're all sort of connected to it in different ways. So if you're not seen as a first-class citizen, then obviously it means all kinds of stuff that can be done to you in terms of how you're treated by the police, in terms of other issues, in terms of voting rights or the lack of voting rights, in terms of access to equal chances of a good education on the job market and so forth. So all of that sort of first-class versus second-class status, it means it requires much more than just the formal granting of equal status, which you had after the Civil War in terms of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. So basically, people of color, in many respects, are still second-class citizens even now, and the manifestation of continuing differential police violence against blacks is one of the manifestations of this, because this is stuff that would be harder, don't want to say impossible, but harder to do. And the sort of vastly differential black and brown and red population, the prison system, again, it's a manifestation of the same thing. Racial exploitation, okay, so people associate, if you know any sort of history of political philosophy, exploitation associated very much with the Marxist tradition, Marxism seen as discredited, so that follows, exploitation doesn't matter anymore. Well, that's obviously crazy, because you can develop a concept of exploitation that relies just on mainstream liberal principles. So slavery is obviously a case of exploitation, and I would argue that Jim Crow, the postbellum period, that's also an example of exploitation. And what we're seeing today, there's been much more discussion than there used to be, which is very good, of the wealth gap between white and black, and white and Latinx households, and that's a result of the history of racial exploitation. Not just going back to slavery in the case of blacks, but things like, for example, the implementation of the GI Bill. So in World War II, you have, black soldiers fighting to defeat fascism. They're fighting, of course, in a segregated army. The army is not desegregated until after World War II. And then what makes it worse is that when they come back to the United States thinking, and this has been a sort of pattern throughout Black American life, okay, we fought in the war against the British, therefore get equal status. We fought with the North in the Civil War, therefore get equal status. We fought in World War I, we fought in World War II. It's been a continual pattern. The idea is you do your military service, surely now at last will get sort of first-class status. And each time it has failed to happen. Anyway, so to sort of add insult to injury, what happens is that the GI Bill, which plays a crucial role in assisting many white GIs in terms of stuff like buying a home, getting an education, etc., it is implemented at the local level. So it's not written in a discriminatory way at the federal level, but it's left to local people to implement. And the result is it's implemented in a discriminatory fashion. And the crucial book here is a book by a well-known political theorist, Ira Katznelson, When Affirmative Action Was White. And he argues in that book that had the GI Bill been implemented in an equitable fashion, a fair fashion, then many of the problems we're facing now, all these years after World War II, might well have been addressed. So racial exploitation, in terms of slavery, in terms of Jim Crow, in terms of not having equal chances to get a mortgage, in terms of discrimination and bank loans, there's a whole set of processes that you can make a case. And of course, we need to bring in native peoples as well and what happened to them, that the country is founded on racial exploitation. That part of what white supremacy means is that you're going to exploit people of color to the benefit of white. And the manifestation of this, as I say, is in this huge wealth gap. So second principle, ending racial exploitation. And that doesn't just mean ending current practices, but making up for past practices. So, there were discussions last summer, before the House, of the possibility of reparations. It's that's been sort of brought up repeatedly by Black Americans since the Civil War. And I think that a good case can be made for that. And we need to talk about issues like that. And then finally, in terms of respect, there's a sense in which disrespect runs through all three principles, because of course it's because you're seen as second class citizen, you can be disrespected. It's because you're seen as not somebody who's equally can be exploited. But apart from those manifestations, the political manifestation, the economic manifestation, there's disrespect in terms of symbolism, in terms of public symbolism. And this has come right to the fore, as you know, DJ, in terms of recent weeks' events, because things like the Confederate flag, Confederate monuments, institutions named after racist figures, military installations, these are all manifestations where it's a case of they're supporting Confederate generals who are traitors to the Union and who are trying to maintain slavery. You're basically sending a signal out in the public sphere: you are not an equal, we can disrespect you. And of course, there's an interaction between official public disrespect and then the attitudes individual whites take up. So it's not within the power of the state to sort of get into the minds of individual white citizens and saying you must respect people of color. That's a matter for ethics rather than sort of government legislation. But what you can certainly do is say that insofar as the government is supposed to be responsible to all its citizens, white and people of color, it must respect them all equally. So my claim is that these three principles of corrective racial justice, if they were in fact followed through in all their manifestations, would have a massive effect on changing the nature of the country.
Absolutely, thank you. And one thing that I kind of that stood out to me was when you're discussing reparations and how a lot of people are stuck thinking about it as sort of reparations for slavery, but it's more than reparations for just slavery, which is a big event unto itself, but also including the remaining history of racial exploitation that has continued since the abolition of slavery. So including
Absolutely.
events like the GI Bill and housing exploitation and different things like that. So it would be a much bigger project than just sort of paying reparations to the people who descend from slaves, but really paying reparations to people who have suffered under this system of white supremacy.
Yes, and again, linking up with what Dario was saying earlier, that's why the narrative is so crucial. So as I say, I'm an immigrant. I came here as an adult. I did not go to high school in the United States. But the impression I get, and I've said this at more than one campus visit where I've given talks, I've said, to the audience, the student audience, okay, guys, I'm going to give you a depiction of what you're taught in high school. I didn't go to American high school, but tell me if I'm wrong. And basically, without seeming to caricature things, it's basically like this. Slavery was bad. But then Lincoln freed the slaves, and basically it's been cool ever since. So in a sort of some variant of this bizarre story, ignoring the fact that, after slavery in the postbellum period, you have the betrayal of Reconstruction, you have, the institutionalization of Jim Crow, you have thousands of unpunished lynchings, you have disenfranchisement of blacks, and that history is not put up front and central as it should be. So it then means that, white students, white kids who get this education are then going to be disadvantaged in trying to understand why is it that all these years later, there's still such a gap between, whites and blacks, whites and other people of color. You cannot understand unless you know the history. So part of what I mentioned as respect would also be a revision of the curriculum to talk about the centrality of white supremacy to American political life and how it has shaped everybody, both whites and people of color also.
Absolutely, yeah. So it's about the curriculum too, and acknowledging white supremacy and talking
Absolutely.
about it, making sure people are aware instead of sweeping it under the rug. So I definitely appreciate what you're saying there.